Imagine a country with a war chest of over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, eyeing the most important chipmaker on the planet, a company valued around $1.5 trillion. It sounds like an audacious financial headline. China's $3.3 trillion versus TSMC's approximately $1.5 trillion. Could it really be as simple as writing a check? Could China, in theory, buy the world's most advanced semiconductor company outright? This question isn't just financial. It cuts to the core of technology leadership and geopolitical power. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, isn't any ordinary company. It's the linchpin of the global electronics supply chain, fabricating about 90% of the world's most advanced chips. If Beijing could somehow take control of this silicon shield, it would upend the global tech landscape overnight. The idea is both tantalizing and terrifying, raising a complex mystery. On paper, China might afford to buy TSMC, but in reality, what insurmountable barriers stand in the way? Let's start with the raw numbers, money, in its most unambiguous form. TSMC's market capitalization is hovering around the trillion-plus range. As of late 2025, the company's value on the stock market is well above $1 trillion, about 36 trillion new Taiwan dollars. At various peaks, it's been cited near $1.5 trillion, reflecting how indispensable TSMC is to industries, from smartphones to artificial intelligence. This valuation is staggering, larger than the entire annual GDP of countries like Taiwan itself. Taiwan's 2023 GDP was about $755 billion, meaning TSMC is worth more than the whole Taiwanese economy. It's an almost surreal figure for a single corporation. But now consider China's financial might. The People's Bank of China sits on the world's largest foreign currency reserves, upwards of $3.3 trillion as of late 2025. That's a pile of US dollars, euro, and other currencies accumulated from decades of trade surpluses. In theory, those reserves exist to stabilize China's currency and economy, but if one were to repurpose a chunk of it, the cash is there. Purely on paper, China's state could afford to buy TSMC outright, even with a hefty premium added. In corporate takeovers, acquirers usually must pay extra above the market price, a control premium, to persuade shareholders to sell. Historically, most M&A deals come with premiums in the range of 10% to 50%, often around 20 to 30% for a large public company. For a $1.5 trillion company, that implies an offer in the ballpark of $2.0 trillion might be needed to tempt shareholders. Astoundingly, even that magnitude is within China's theoretical means, given its reserves. To appreciate how extraordinary this scenario is, compare it to the largest mergers and acquisitions ever attempted. The biggest corporate deal in history, Vodafone's takeover of Mannesmann in 2000, was about $203 billion, a mere fraction of what a TSMC buyout would cost. We are contemplating a transaction an order of magnitude larger than anything the business world has seen. It would be like 10 of the largest mergers in history combined. From a purely financial perspective, China writing a multi-trillion-dollar check, while extreme, is not impossible given the state's resources and leverage over its state-owned banks and funds. After all, Beijing has funneled colossal sums into its semiconductor ambitions already, committing an estimated $150 billion in support for its chip industry over recent years. So the idea, why not just buy the leading chip firm instead, has an intuitive appeal. If we suspend reality for a moment, how might such a buyout theoretically work? TSMC is a publicly traded company, listed on the Taiwan Stock Exchange, and also available as ADRs in New York. In theory, an interested buyer, say a Chinese sovereign fund or a proxy company, could attempt to acquire shares on the open market or launch a tender offer, proposing to purchase shares from existing shareholders at a premium. With enough shares, over 50%, the buyer would gain a controlling stake. Normally, acquisitions of this scale would be executed via a direct offer to shareholders and need the company's board approval, or a hostile takeover if the board resists. A leveraged buyout isn't plausible here. The target is far too large to finance with debt. But China's cash hoard means it wouldn't need much debt anyway. It could be an all-cash offer, a rarity at such scale. The sheer financial firepower behind a Chinese bid would be jaw-dropping, perhaps presented as a consortium of state-backed investors making a friendly offer at a very generous price to all TSMC shareholders. In theory, it's the kind of premium that pension funds and investors might find hard to refuse. After all, who wouldn't sell their stock if offered, say, 50% above the current price? And from China's perspective, the allure is clear. TSMC is the crown jewel of semiconductor manufacturing. It's the only company mass-producing chips at the bleeding-edge 3-nanometer node, with 2-nanometer on the way, and it commands over 67% of the global pure-play foundry market. By comparison, China's biggest foundry, SMIC, holds just about 6%. TSMC's client list reads like a who's who of tech: Apple, Nvidia, AMD, Qualcomm, the companies powering modern computing. If Beijing could somehow buy this capability, it would instantly obtain what years of industrial policy have struggled to build: cutting-edge fabrication tech, a world-class engineering talent pool, and control over a supply chain that the modern world depends on. It would be a leapfrog event in the US-China tech race, potentially handing China dominance over critical technology without firing a shot. That's the utopian vision on paper. Money talks, problem solved. But even as we sketch it out, it starts to sound like a fantasy for one simple reason. TSMC is not a normal company, and Taiwan is not a normal market. The moment we leave the clean arithmetic of balance sheets and enter the messy realm of law, politics, and security, we slam into formidable barriers. To see them, we must ask, beyond having the cash, what else would China need for this buyout to actually happen? As it turns out, virtually everything outside of money would be working against it. For China to buy TSMC, it would require not only deep pockets, but also cooperation, or at least acquiescence, from a host of actors: the Taiwanese government, TSMC's leadership, foreign regulators, customers, and suppliers. In reality, that cooperation ranges from unlikely to impossible. Let's unpack the major barriers. 1. Taiwanese law and national interest. Start with Taiwan itself, the home of TSMC. Any major change in ownership of TSMC, especially involving a mainland Chinese entity, would face intense scrutiny or outright prohibition by Taipei. Remember, TSMC isn't just a company in Taiwan. It's considered strategic infrastructure and a matter of national security. Taiwan has an entire legal framework, the act governing relations between the people of the Taiwan area and the mainland area, that regulates economic interaction with China. By policy, Taiwan sharply restricts investments and acquisitions by Chinese investors in sensitive sectors, and semiconductors are at the top of that list. In practice, a Chinese takeover of a prized Taiwanese tech firm is beyond taboo. It's something the law is designed to prevent. Officials in Taipei would simply not approve such a transaction. In fact, under Taiwanese law, even TSMC's own outbound investments, like building fabs overseas, above a certain size, require government approval. One can imagine, then, the government's stance on a large inbound investment into TSMC by an adversarial power. It would be dead on arrival. Taiwan's authorities have the legal power to veto share transfers or mergers that threaten national security or economic stability, and they undoubtedly would use it in this case. Taiwan's leadership has been explicit about TSMC's role as a silicon shield, a deterrent and protection for the island. As President Tsai Ing-wen famously described, Taiwan's semiconductor prowess helps protect itself and others from aggressive attempts by authoritarian regimes to disrupt global supply chains. Selling that shield to an authoritarian regime, the very threat it's guarding against, would nullify one of Taiwan's core strategic assets. It would be like selling off the protective wall to the party laying siege. No Taiwanese administration, regardless of political party, could survive the domestic backlash if it allowed TSMC to fall into Chinese hands. Public opinion in Taiwan would consider it tantamount to capitulation. TSMC's importance to Taiwan's economy, contributing roughly 15% of GDP by some estimates, and its identity is hard to overstate. It's not just a company, it's a symbol of Taiwan's success and a guarantor of its security. In short, the local resistance to a Chinese buyout would be absolute, from the government, media, and likely TSMC's own management and employees. Even if individual shareholders were tempted by a cash offer, Taiwan's regulators could block the sale of a controlling stake on national security grounds long before it ever closed. Laws and regulations exist for exactly this scenario, preventing strategic assets from falling under Chinese control. And unlike a typical corporate takeover fight, here the entire state would mobilize to stop it. 2. Foreign investment reviews, US and allies. Let's suppose, for argument's sake, one tried to skirt Taiwan's veto by structuring the deal indirectly, perhaps via an offshore entity or a consortium that masks Chinese involvement. Modern investment screening regimes are designed to sniff out the ultimate beneficial owners of a deal, and any whiff of Chinese state connection to a TSMC takeover would alarm capitals around the world. Consider the United States. TSMC has significant operations in the US, a huge Arizona fab under construction, plus R&D offices, and it supplies virtually every major American tech hardware firm. This gives the US government jurisdiction and a vested interest. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which reviews foreign takeovers of US-linked companies, would undoubtedly step in. CFIUS has a history of blocking much smaller semiconductor-related acquisitions over national security concerns, including cases where Chinese firms tried to buy American chip companies. In one notable example, CFIUS and the US president stopped a mere $1.3 billion sale of Lattice Semiconductor to a Chinese-backed fund in 2017, citing risks like transfer of sensitive technology, the acquirer's ties to the Chinese state, and the importance of the semiconductor supply chain for the US military. Those exact concerns would apply 100-fold for any attempt on TSMC. The US would view Chinese control of TSMC as an unacceptable threat to its national security and economic stability. In fact, CFIUS might not even need to formally review. Higher authorities would likely make their opposition clear immediately. During a previous episode, even a non-Chinese company's bid, Singapore-based Broadcom's attempt to acquire Qualcomm in 2018, was blocked because US officials feared it would weaken Qualcomm and hand an edge to China in 5G technology. If that drew a line, imagine a literal Chinese takeover of the world's top chip manufacturer. Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, all would consider it a strategic emergency. The European Union also now maintains an FDI, foreign direct investment screening mechanism, and European governments have become increasingly vigilant about Chinese takeovers in critical tech sectors. In 2021, for instance, Italy vetoed the acquisition of an Italian semiconductor company by a Chinese group. European allies, who rely on TSMC for their automotive and industrial chips, would not stand idle. They could invoke security reviews to block any transfer of TSMC's subsidiaries or technology in their jurisdictions. Even Japan, where TSMC is building a joint venture fab, would surely invoke its own laws to prevent Japanese-origin tech or assets from falling under Chinese control. Crucially, global regulators have become wise to stealth tactics. If China attempted a covert buyout through intermediaries or shell companies, beneficial ownership tests would reveal who's really behind the curtain. A precedent was set in 2016 when a supposed German investor's bid for a chip equipment maker, Aixtron, was stopped after it was discovered the ultimate buyers were Chinese. Any entity attempting to swallow TSMC will be scrutinized to its roots. The moment any connection to the Chinese state or a state-funded entity is found, the deal's prospects drop to zero. In essence, any plausible path for China to gain legal control of TSMC triggers legal tripwires in multiple countries. From Taiwan's Cross-Strait Relations Act to CFIUS to the EU's screening, the world has built sturdy legal walls precisely to block what's contemplated here. 3. Export controls and tech choke points. Legal and ownership issues aside, let's say in a hypothetical scenario, China somehow did get its hands on a controlling stake of TSMC. An even more immediate dagger looms: export controls. Semiconductor manufacturing is a brutally complex global endeavor. No company is an island. TSMC relies on critical equipment and software from the US, Japan, the Netherlands, and other Western-aligned nations to operate its fabs. Over the past few years, these nations have imposed strict export controls to prevent cutting-edge chip tech from reaching China's own fabs. The moment TSMC is identified as a Chinese-controlled entity, those controls would almost certainly extend to it as well. For example, TSMC's crown jewels, its extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography machines, come exclusively from ASML in the Netherlands. The Dutch government, under US pressure, has already forbidden any EUV sales to China. If TSMC were even partially China-owned, it's inconceivable that ASML would be allowed to continue supplying or servicing TSMC with its latest machines. Similarly, the United States controls the electronic design automation, EDA, software, and chip design tools that TSMC's engineers use to lay out advanced circuits. US policy is to block China from accessing advanced design tools and fabrication equipment. A Chinese-owned TSMC would immediately find itself on the wrong side of those restrictions, effectively cutting it off from the lifeblood of modern chip-making technology. This means that even if China bought TSMC, it might acquire a hollow shell for future tech. TSMC's current technology might stay with the company in the short term, but its development pipeline would be strangled. The company could struggle to buy new equipment, get crucial software updates, or even receive spare parts and maintenance for existing tools. Keep in mind, TSMC rolls out a new process technology every 2 to 3 years to stay at the leading edge. Without Western lithography machines or materials, it cannot advance to the next node. Within a few years, a TSMC cut off from its suppliers would fall behind, exactly the fate China has been trying to avoid for its own domestic fabs. In other words, the very act of China taking control could trigger a tech embargo that freezes TSMC's advantage. Moreover, export controls also cover expertise. The US has restrictions on US persons supporting advanced Chinese chip production. That includes American engineers or even foreign engineers using US origin technology. TSMC employs talent globally, and many of its key technologies involve US contributions, from patents to components. Under a Chinese ownership scenario, many engineers, American or otherwise, might be legally barred from working with the company on advanced projects. We could see an exodus of expatriate talent. Even Taiwanese engineers might balk. Some could choose to quit rather than work under a Chinese flag, especially if they foresee the company's decline due to sanctions. In essence, a takeover would likely trigger a brain drain and the loss of indispensable human capital. Fourth, national security and geopolitical shockwaves. Lastly, consider the broader strategic picture. The reason this deal would be blocked so vehemently is because it's not viewed as just business. It's about control of a strategic asset. If by some miracle China legally acquired TSMC, the geopolitical response would be explosive. The United States and allies would likely treat it as a hostile realignment of the semiconductor supply chain. TSMC might immediately be added to US export blacklists, essentially treating it as equivalent to a Chinese military-linked company. Governments around the world, especially the US, would also worry that Beijing could use TSMC as leverage. A researcher at Rand Corporation, Raymond Kuo, encapsulated this fear, saying, "I could imagine Beijing using its control of these production facilities to coerce other countries. Semiconductors would become another point of leverage that Beijing could use in economic or political coercion of other countries." In other words, if China owned TSMC, it could theoretically threaten or favor supply of critical chips to punish or reward other nations. That scenario, an authoritarian-controlled chokepoint of the digital economy, is precisely what Western national security planners dread. It's why they would sooner destroy that chokepoint than let it fall under Beijing's control. Indeed, some US strategists have openly mused about a scorched earth policy, where TSMC's facilities would be evacuated or sabotaged if an invasion were imminent, to deny them to China. All these barriers boil down to one reality. TSMC cannot be bought like a regular company because too many stakeholders see it as a strategic necessity. It's protected not by a single law or factor, but by a thicket of legal, political, and economic defenses. Even if one or two could somehow be bypassed, the rest would close in. The analogy might be trying to capture a unicorn kept inside a fortress, behind multiple walls, and guarded by many sentinels. Financial muscle can charge at the walls, but it won't get far before the defenses kick in. However, for the sake of understanding fully, let's play out the hypothetical. What if China tried anyway? What if, despite all these barriers, a hostile bid was mounted under the radar, or in defiance of international pressure? It's a thought experiment that reveals just how self-defeating and chaotic such an attempt would become. Picture the scene. News breaks that a shadowy investor, widely assumed to be backed by Chinese state entities, has started massively buying up TSMC shares. Rumors swirl of an impending hostile takeover bid, offering, say, a 50% premium to all shareholders. The market goes into frenzy. TSMC's stock price would likely surge on speculation. But beyond the stock ticker, every alarm bell from Taipei to Washington to Brussels would start ringing loudly. Here's what would almost certainly happen next, across various fronts. Taiwan's response. The Taiwanese government would move within hours to block the purchase. Regulators at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Investment Commission would likely freeze any large share transactions to suspected Chinese buyers. Taiwan's National Security Council might declare the attempt a national security threat. Legal tools could range from injunctions to emergency legislation banning Chinese entities from owning more than a token amount of any major semiconductor firm. There might even be talk in Taipei of the nuclear option, the government itself stepping in to temporarily nationalize TSMC or buy shares to prevent foreign takeover. Ironically, Taiwan's government already holds a sizable stake of around 6% in TSMC via its National Development Fund, and it sits on TSMC's board. It would use that influence decisively. TSMC's management, for its part, would almost certainly side with the government to resist. We could expect public statements from TSMC's CEO and perhaps its revered founder, Morris Chang, assuring that TSMC will not entertain any such offer. They might rally domestic shareholders, many of which are Taiwanese institutions and individuals, not to sell. In short, within Taiwan, the bid would be treated as a hostile act by Beijing against one of Taiwan's crown jewels and met with unified resistance. Legal injunctions and asset freezes. Beyond Taiwan's borders, legal defenses would activate. If the buying was happening via stock markets in New York or elsewhere, for instance accumulating TSMC's American depository shares, those could trigger CFI-US intervention. The US might issue an emergency order to halt the acquisition of any TSMC shares by the entities in question, pending review. It's even possible the US Treasury could slap sanctions on the would-be acquirers, especially if they're linked to the Chinese state or military. This could freeze any US dollar financing for the deal. The EU and other jurisdictions might coordinate similar blocking measures if any part of the transaction touches their markets or citizens. Essentially, lawyers and regulators would work overtime to throw sand in the gears. Court orders, regulatory reviews, anything to delay and ultimately stop the closing of the deal. Customer exodus. Perhaps the most immediate business consequence. TSMC's customers panic. Big tech companies like Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and Qualcomm, which rely on TSMC for their advanced chips, would view a Chinese control as catastrophic. Many of these companies have contingency plans for geopolitical risk in Taiwan. A sudden ownership change to a Chinese entity would probably force their hand to diversify suppliers rapidly. We could see emergency discussions at Apple to shift some chip orders to alternatives, Samsung Electronics Foundry or Intel, if possible. Companies might publicly announce intentions to pull out of TSMC unless the situation is resolved, both to reassure their own stakeholders and to put pressure on halting the takeover. In essence, the trust and neutrality that TSMC offers, Silicon Switzerland serving all sides, would vanish. If TSMC were perceived as a Chinese-controlled entity, American and European firms would fear intellectual property theft, sanctions risk, and political abuse of their chip supply. They would feel compelled to cut ties. This customer flight would, ironically, start eroding TSMC's value immediately. Even the mere attempt of a takeover could scare clients. The company's valuation could plunge if markets sense that its biggest revenue sources might walk away under Chinese ownership. Supply chain and toolmakers. The equipment and material suppliers would also react swiftly. As discussed, companies like ASML, lithography machines, Applied Materials, Lam Research, Chip Tools, Tokyo Electron, and other key suppliers would likely pause shipments and support the moment it looks like TSMC could fall under Chinese control. Some of this would be by direction of their governments, export control compliance, and some out of their own legal caution. TSMC's operations depend on continuous deliveries of components, chemicals, software updates. A disruption here could slow or stop production. And while it's true that China could attempt to substitute some inputs with its own, many of the most advanced tools have no ready substitute. So in a short span, TSMC's factories might face maintenance issues or production snags as suppliers retreat to see how the dust settles. Human talent factor. TSMC's 70,000-plus employees, especially the top engineers and managers, would find themselves in a profound dilemma. Would they continue working under a new regime? Some might see personal opportunity if the new owners promised investment, but many others would be deeply uncomfortable, particularly those from Taiwan, who may not want to work for an employer under the sway of Beijing. There could be a wave of resignations, or quietly, headhunters from rival companies, including Intel, Samsung, or up-and-coming chip firms, might start picking off talent not willing to stay through the turmoil. And critically, the brain trust of TSMC, the scientists and engineers who drive its innovation, could dissipate if they perceive the company's golden era is over. Remember that much of TSMC's know-how is tacit knowledge in its people. If a significant number of them leave, the magic leaves with them. Political and military tensions. A Chinese move on TSMC, even financially, would ratchet up political tensions dramatically. It could be seen as Beijing attempting a de facto annexation of a vital Taiwanese entity, basically a step toward unification by other means. This might inflame public sentiment in Taiwan and harden Taipei's stance against Beijing. The US and its allies would also interpret it as an aggressive move. Worst case, one could imagine this contributing to military miscalculations. For instance, China might preemptively promise protection or even contemplate moving assets to secure TSMC, a far-fetched scenario, but these are the kind of fears that could be voiced. The US might, conversely, consider ways to physically safeguard key TSMC personnel or technology, e.g., accelerating efforts to relocate some experts to the US. We edge into sci-fi territory here, but the core point is that a takeover attempt would dramatically heighten the already fraught US-China-Taiwan triangle. It could hasten the decoupling in tech and deepen mistrust on all sides. Market reaction. Beyond TSMC's stock, global financial markets might view this as a black swan event. The tech sector could see a sell-off as investors worry about supply chain disruptions. Shares of companies reliant on TSMC might drop until they clarify contingency plans. Conversely, shares in rival chip manufacturers, Samsung, Intel, could jump on the expectation they'll pick up business. The Taiwan stock market and currency might tumble on fears that this is a precursor to more aggressive moves on Taiwan by China. And ironically, China's own markets might react nervously. Such a bold move could invite heavy US sanctions on China's tech sector broadly, affecting Chinese tech stocks negatively. It's not clear that even China's government would be ready to weather the global market chaos that a hostile bid for TSMC would unleash. When you sum up these reactions, a paradox emerges. If China attempted to seize TSMC through a hostile bid, the very act would destroy much of what makes TSMC valuable. It's the classic dog catching the car scenario. TSMC's strengths, cutting-edge technology, international customers, global supply chain integration, would be compromised as a result of the takeover effort. By the time the hypothetical dust settled, even if China somehow ended up with a controlling stake, they might find they've paid a fortune for a crippled asset. TSMC could lose access to the latest tools, many of its best people, and its top customers. Its market cap could plummet, and any strategic gain for China would be greatly diminished or outright negated by countermeasures. In a way, it would be a Pyrrhic victory, or no victory at all, since the deal likely can't consummate to begin with.